Montana Territory, June 1883. The wind carried the scent of wild sage and dust as the sun dropped low behind the Absaroka Range, casting gold over the dry earth. On the edge of the town of Bitter Hollow, a woman in a faded blue dress stood alone, her hands wrapped tight around a worn carpetbag. Her name was Blythe Carrigan, and the townsfolk whispered behind her back like she could not hear. 3 babies, they said. Gone before their first breath. She's cursed. She heard it. She always did, but she did not flinch anymore. Blythe had arrived in Bitter Hollow 3 days ago, stepping off the stage with nothing but her bag and a letter from her late husband's cousin saying she could stay until harvest. The cousin's wife, however, had not been kind. She sent Blythe out the next morning, saying she could not risk the bad luck under her roof. Now, with no coin and no place to sleep, Blythe stood at the edge of the McAllister ranch, staring at the wide wooden gate like it held the answer to all the aching in her chest. A horse's hoofbeats slowed behind her. She turned and saw a man dismounting, tall and broad-shouldered, with dust on his boots and a rifle slung over his back. "You lost?" he asked, voice low, steady. She shook her head. "No, just thinking." He pushed his hat back, revealing deep-set eyes the color of burnt amber. "Name's Paxton McAllister. This here's my land." "I know," Blythe said. "I was told you sometimes take in work hands." He looked her over. She lifted her chin, expecting the same look the others gave her, pity, maybe fear. But he just asked, "You any good with horses?" "I know how to saddle and brush them. I can cook, mend, and milk. I can keep a house clean. And I do not faint when blood shows up." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You come with a husband. He died 3 winters ago. Children?" She hesitated. That question always came. 3. None lived long enough to bury. He nodded slowly. "I will give you 2 weeks. You sleep in the loft above the stable. You earn your keep." She blinked. "You do not care what they say. I care what I see with my own eyes." That night Blythe slept on hay with a thin blanket and a full belly. She did not cry. She had no tears left. The next morning she rose before the sun and scrubbed the kitchen until the floor shone. She swept the porch and brought in water. By midday she was out in the pasture, helping Paxton's younger ranch hand drive a stubborn chestnut mare into the pen. Paxton watched from the fence. "She listens better to you than to Levy." She just needed a calm voice. Blythe wiped her brow with her sleeve. "You married young?" he asked. 17. "Thought life would bloom from the first kiss." She shrugged. "It did not." He said nothing, but his gaze lingered on her a moment too long. By the end of the week, Blythe had stitched every torn shirt in the house and organized the pantry. She did not speak unless spoken to, but she worked like she had something to prove. Maybe she did. Maybe she wanted to prove her heart still beat. On the 8th day, a storm rolled in, wild and fast. Paxton rode out to bring in calves that had scattered in the gulch. When he returned, soaked through and bleeding from a gash on his arm, Blythe was waiting with hot broth and clean cloth. "Let me see," she said, guiding him to sit. "You do not have to," I said. "Let me see." She cleaned the wound in silence. His breathing slowed under her touch. "You always this stubborn?" he asked. "I have lived through worse than your cut," she replied, wrapping the bandage tight. He caught her wrist when she stood. "You do not flinch when I touch you." "Should I? Most folks do." "I do not believe you are like most folks." He let go, slow and careful. "Neither are you." That night, as thunder cracked and the wind howled, Blythe lay awake in the loft, staring at the rafters. Below, the horses shifted, and somewhere in the dark, Paxton's boots paced the barn. She closed her eyes and breathed deep. 2 days later, she found a little boy no older than 7 crouched near the barn. His face was dirty and his eyes sharp with fear. "You hungry?" she asked gently. He did not answer, just looked past her, ready to bolt. She set down a piece of cornbread. "You can eat and run if you want." He snatched it and ran. But the next morning he came back. By the third day, Paxton caught sight of the child and stopped in his tracks. "Where did you find him?" "He found me. He has not spoken." "I do not know him. He is not local." Blythe knelt beside the boy, who stared up at her with wide brown eyes. "I do not think he has anyone," she said. Paxton looked at her. "You want him to stay. I think he needs us." Paxton nodded once. "Then he stays." They named him Caleb a week past. Then two. Blythe started laughing again, small, soft sounds at first, like she had forgotten how. Paxton caught himself watching her whenever she smiled. He started bringing her wildflowers he pretended were picked by accident. She started humming while she worked in the kitchen. One evening, as the sky turned pink, she stood on the porch, her apron dusted with flour, watching Caleb chase the chickens. Paxton stepped beside her. "He follows you like a shadow," he said. "He just wants to feel safe. You make people feel safe." She looked up at him, her voice low. "Do I make you feel that way?" He reached for her hand. "You make me feel like I have not been living right until now." Her breath caught, but she did not pull away. "You know what they say about me," she whispered. "About what I have lost. I do not care what they say. I care that you stayed. That you fought to keep going." She turned to face him fully. "You are not afraid." "I am more afraid of never knowing what it feels like to love someone like you." She stepped into him, her hand settling over his heart. "Then ask me." He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Blythe Carrigan, will you stay with me?" She nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes, I will stay." And just like that, the curse broke. Not by magic, but by a man who saw her pain and offered something stronger: love. The first frost came early that year, brushing the grass with silver before dawn, and turning the breath of cattle into steam that hung low over the pastures. By then, Blythe had moved into the small bedroom at the back of the house, not by formal invitation, but because one morning she was there, and Paxton had poured her coffee like it had always belonged in her hands. Caleb had taken to sleeping curled beneath the old buffalo robe by the hearth. He never spoke, but he followed Blythe's lead in everything: feeding the chickens, scrubbing the tin pans, watching how she tucked the corners of the quilts just so. When she taught him to tie his boots, he stared at her hands with a quiet focus, then mimicked the motion until his knot held. Paxton noticed the shift most in the silences. Where once Blythe had moved like she expected to be left behind, now her steps carried weight. She leaned her elbows on the porch rail at dusk and let herself linger, watching the way the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods along the creek. "You're not waiting for someone to change their mind anymore," Paxton said one evening, his voice low. "I used to think every roof I stood under would fall in if I stayed too long," Blythe said, not turning. "But this place hasn't. You're part of it now." She glanced at him then, her eyes steady. "I want to make sure he remembers this as his first home. Not the place he ran to, but the place he grew from. He will." Paxton looked toward the barn, where Caleb had begun brushing down the mule without being asked. "He's got your spine, that boy." "I think he had it before I found him," she said softly. "He just needed someone to see it." That winter, snow came heavy and stayed. Paxton and Levy spent long days hauling hay out to the cattle, breaking ice on the troughs with the back of an axe. Blythe kept the stove hot and the larder rationed to last. She showed Caleb how to sew wool patches onto his mittens, how to use the back of a spoon to scrape sugar from the bottom of the barrel. One morning in January, Paxton caught a fever that clung to his lungs. Blythe kept to his side, changing cloths, coaxing him to drink broth even when his hands shook too hard to hold the cup. "You're not sleeping," he rasped one night, sweat beading on his brow. "I'll rest when your fever breaks. You always this stubborn." Only when I care." He closed his eyes, but a trace of peace settled in his face. By the third day, the heat in his body began to recede. He sat up with help and watched her stir lard into cornmeal batter, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her face drawn but calm. "You saved me," he said. "You let me," she answered. By February, the thaw began. Snow melted into rivulets that carved shallow paths along the slope behind the barn. Blythe began planting a vegetable patch, marking the soil with a stick while Caleb watched from the fence. "We'll need to plant early to beat the dry months," she told Paxton as they walked the perimeter of the field. "Peas, beans, maybe some turnip if we can get the seed." "You sound like someone who plans to be here a long while." "I do." He stopped walking. "Then I ought to do this right." She turned to face him, puzzled. "You work harder than anyone I've ever known. You raised a boy not your own like he came from your own ribs. You made this house feel like it's got a heart again." "I didn't do it alone." "No. But I wouldn't have done it at all without you." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a ring not new but polished, the silver band plain and strong. "I know what you've lost. I won't promise to replace it. I just want to build something new with you. Something we choose." Her breath caught, but she didn't cry. Instead, she took his hand and pressed it between both of hers. "I've never been asked like that," she said. "I've never asked before." She nodded once. "Then yes. I'll be yours if you'll be mine." They married in the parlor with Levy and a rancher's wife from downriver as witnesses. Caleb stood beside them, holding a small carved horse Paxton had whittled for the occasion. When Blythe said her vows, her voice didn't shake. That night, after the dishes were cleared and Caleb had fallen asleep near the fire with a shawl over his shoulders, Paxton poured 2 tin cups of coffee and handed one to her. "I never believed in luck," he said. "Still don't. Neither do I. But I believe in choosing someone. And choosing them every day after." She reached across the table, laced her fingers through his. "Then let's build that kind of life." And so they did. By early spring, the dirt road to Bitter Hollow had dried enough for the wagon to reach town without sinking to its axles. Blythe sat beside Paxton on the bench seat, her hands tucked beneath a shawl the color of storm clouds. Caleb rode in the back, legs swinging, his eyes fixed on the sky like he was memorizing its shifting blues. Paxton guided the team slow through the narrow Main Street. A few boys kicked a ball of rags near the smithy. A woman with a kerchief over her hair nodded once as they passed, her gaze lingering on Blythe's face longer than it needed to. "You sure you want to do this?" Paxton asked, keeping his voice low. Blythe watched the general store come into view. "I won't hide from a place just because it remembers who I used to be." Inside, the store smelled of leather oil and dry grain. Blythe moved with quiet purpose, selecting calico for curtains, a new kettle and muslin for a shirt she meant to sew for Caleb. Paxton stayed near the barrels of potatoes, talking prices with the owner's son. A woman with silver pins in her hair stepped up beside Blythe at the counter. "I remember you," she said. "You came through with the Carrigan boy. He was sickly, wasn't he?" Blythe set down her bolt of cloth. "He died in Kansas, ma'am, shame, and no children after him either. I have a son now," Blythe said. "His name is Caleb." The woman's mouth tightened. "Not by blood, I hear. He's mine just the same." She didn't wait for a reply. She gathered her bundles and turned, finding Paxton already lifting Caleb from the wagon floor and setting him down. On the ride back, Caleb climbed into Blythe's lap and pressed his ear to her chest. His hands were cold from the wind. "You all right?" Paxton asked, eyes on the road. She knew everything I'd lost, and still found a way to make it sound like I'd done something wrong. "She's still standing where she's always been. You're not. I'm trying not to let it crawl under my skin." "It won't," he said. "Not if you remember you're not the same woman who left this town." That night, Blythe lit a lantern and sat at the kitchen table with her sewing. Caleb slept on a pallet near the stove, curled around a wooden horse Paxton had carved last month. Paxton came in from the barn with a cut on his knuckle and dried mud on his trousers. "You should let Levy handle the south fence next time," Blythe said without looking up. "He's not careful with the latch. The gate swings wide. Lost 2 calves that way last year." She paused her stitching. "You always take things back yourself, don't you? Only what's worth keeping." She set down the needle and reached across the table. "I used to think if I kept my hands busy I wouldn't feel the ache. And now I let it sit beside me. But I don't let it drive." He stepped around the table and knelt beside her chair. "What's driving you now?" She placed her hand over his. "The life we're building. Even if it's quiet, even if no one else sees it, I do." The next day she found a box tucked beneath the porch bench. Inside were 3 small paper-wrapped bundles garden seeds labeled in a careful hand. Peas, carrots, and sweet corn. No name left, only a slip of linen with a single stitched word, "Hope." She brought the box inside, her hands steady. "Who left it?" Paxton asked. "I don't know," she said. "But someone's trying to make peace. You want to plant them?" "I think we should." They worked side by side in the early light, turning the soil with spades and hands. Caleb helped drop the seeds in one by one, his brow furrowed with determination. "You think they'll grow?" he asked. "They will," Blythe said. "Things grow when they're tended." When the first shoots broke through the soil 2 weeks later, Blythe stood at the edge of the garden, her arms crossed over her apron, her eyes bright with something new. Not hope, not quite. Something steadier. Paxton came up beside her, silent for a while. "I was thinking about building another room on the north side," he said. "Something with a window that looks out over the field. For who? For you? For us?" She looked at him, the corners of her mouth lifting. "You think we'll need more space?" "I think we're not done growing." She leaned against his shoulder, wordless. Later that evening they sat on the porch while Caleb chased fireflies in the yard. The air smelled of tilled dirt and pine smoke. Blythe rested her head against Paxton's arm. "I thought I'd spend my life being remembered for what I lost," she murmured. He turned toward her, brushing his thumb against the back of her hand. "Now you'll be remembered for what you built." And in the hush that followed, no wind, no words, just the soft hum of the earth settling into night, Blythe let the weight she'd carried for years slip a little from her shoulders. Not gone, not forgotten, but shared now. And that made all the difference. By late May, the creek behind the house had slowed to a steady murmur, its banks thick with cattail and the first flush of wild iris. The new room Paxton had begun framing stood half-finished, its beams rough but square, catching the light in the evenings when the wind died down. Blythe had taken to sketching small notes on scraps of brown paper where she wanted the shelf to sit, which way the bed should face to catch the morning sun, and tucking them under Paxton's coffee mug without a word. "You've got opinions," he said one morning, finding another of her notes pinned beneath a slice of buttered bread. "I do," she replied, folding the dish towel. "You married a woman, not a ghost." That evening, while hammering the last joist into place, Paxton paused and looked down at her from the roofline. "You ever think you'd want to teach again?" She shaded her eyes with her hand. "What makes you ask that?" Levy said the old schoolhouse near the river's been sitting empty since the teacher left for Miles City. He heard their looking again. Blythe stepped back, letting her gaze drift toward the distant cottonwood grove where the one-room schoolhouse sat quiet and leaning eastward. "I haven't stood in front of a chalkboard in 7 years. You could still do it." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to the corner of the garden and checked the string beans, touching the leaves like she was reading something in their shape. Later, as Caleb played with a stick and an old metal ring near the barn, she sat beside Paxton on the porch, her hands folded in her lap. "I used to believe teaching was something I'd do until I had children of my own," she said. "But when that didn't come, I stopped thinking I had anything worth passing on." Paxton leaned back against the post. "You've passed plenty on already. Caleb's not the same boy you found." "Neither am I. I'd have to walk into a room and convince people their children are safe with me, that I'm not marked by what I've lost. Then maybe that's exactly why you should go." The next morning, Blythe rode into town with Caleb and waited outside the telegraph office while Paxton inquired. She kept her back straight and her face unreadable, watching the wind pull at the laundry someone had hung behind the boarding house. When he stepped back out, he handed her a folded slip of paper. "Said they'd be glad to meet you. No promises, but they'll listen." She tucked the paper into her coat without opening it. "That's all I need." The meeting was set for the following Thursday. That week, Blythe rose earlier than usual and set aside her best blouse, the one with the hand-stitched cuffs she'd finished last month. She cleaned her boots with beeswax and mended a small tear in the hem of her skirt. Caleb watched her from the doorway, twisting a bit of twine between his fingers. "Why do you look different?" he asked. "Because sometimes people listen better when you show them you take yourself seriously." "Will they let you teach?" "I don't know yet." He hesitated, then asked, "Can I come with you?" She crouched down and brushed the hair back from his face. "This time I need to go alone. But I'll come back, no matter how it goes." As she rode off, she didn't look back. The schoolhouse sat near the bend in the river, its whitewashed boards faded and the bell rope hanging slack through a broken window. Inside, the benches were dusty, but the floor held firm. Blythe stepped in and ran her fingers along the teacher's desk, then turned as the door opened behind her. A man in a dark coat and wire-rimmed spectacles entered, nodding politely. "Mrs. McAllister, Miss Carrigan," she corrected, then added, "I kept my name. But I'm married now." He gestured for her to sit. "You were recommended by your husband's foreman, said you kept a boy from running wild and a ranch house from falling apart." "That's not teaching," he smiled faintly. "It's a good start." They spoke for nearly an hour. He asked about arithmetic, reading levels, discipline without a rod. She answered plainly, never softening her voice, never hiding what she didn't know. When it was done, he stood and offered her his hand. "You start in 2 weeks if you still want it." She gripped his hand firmly. "I do." By the time she returned home, the sun was setting low and the new room's roof was half shingled. Caleb ran to meet her, his arms full of wild onion he'd pulled from the edge of the fence. "Well?" Paxton asked, eyeing her face. She stepped down from the wagon and smiled, not wide, just enough to reach her eyes. "They said yes." He reached out, resting a hand on her waist. "Then I guess I'll have to get used to eating supper later." "You'll survive." That night, after the dishes were washed and Caleb had fallen asleep with his head against the dog's flank, Blythe sat with her feet tucked beneath her, watching Paxton sharpen a blade by lantern light. "I used to think loving someone meant waiting for the worst to come," she said quietly. "Now I think it means trusting the good when it finally stays." He looked up, his expression thoughtful. "You think we've earned it? I know we have." Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of lilac from the bush she'd planted near the porch steps. It would bloom soon. Everything was blooming. The 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Blythe spent her mornings with Caleb, teaching him to read from an old primer Levy had found in a trunk under the bunkhouse. In the afternoons, she rode out to the schoolhouse to sweep the floor, scrub the chalkboard, and air out the musty smell that had settled into the walls. Paxton added a proper latch to the school door and carved pegs for the children's coats by the entry. He never said much while he worked, but Blythe noticed how he lingered in the doorway before he left, as if he were memorizing the space that would soon belong to her. On the last Sunday before she was due to begin, Blythe stood at the edge of the pasture with her skirt tucked into her boots, examining a split rail where the cattle had pushed through. Paxton leaned against the fence beside her, arms crossed. "I was thinking," he said, "after the spring roundup we could take the wagon up past the ridge, camp out near Bear Creek for a night or two." She glanced over. "You planning on hauling Caleb up a mountainside? He's tougher than he looks." She nudged his arm. "And what would we do up there?" "Nothing urgent. Just breathe." The idea sat warm in her chest. "I'd like that." That night she stitched a new dress for the school term, working by lamplight while Paxton read aloud from a newspaper 2 weeks old. Caleb fell asleep near the hearth with a dog-eared drawing book in his lap. When Paxton paused between columns, Blythe asked, "You ever think about what we'd be if none of this had happened?" He looked up, brow furrowed. "You mean if we'd never met, if the world had bent another way?" "I don't think I'd be much of anything," he said. "Not in a way that mattered." She set her sewing aside. "I think you would have been kind no matter where you ended up." He reached out and rested his hand over hers, rough palm against her knuckles. "You gave me reason to put it to use." The first day of school arrived with a light drizzle and the smell of wet cottonwood. Blythe wore her new dress and pinned her hair up with brass combs Paxton had given her in a small wrapped parcel. No note, just left on her pillow that morning. She kissed Caleb's cheek and said she'd be back before the sun dropped behind the ridge. Levy offered to watch him, promising to keep him busy hauling kindling and feeding the hens. The schoolhouse stood quiet when she arrived. By mid-morning, the children began to appear, some on foot, others in wagons. They filed in with wide eyes, whispering and glancing at the slate boards she'd cleaned until her hands ached. She took attendance in careful script, pausing to ask each child how they liked to be called. She didn't raise her voice once. When a boy in the back spat on the floor, she handed him a rag and told him he'd clean the space he dirtied. He did it without protest. By the end of the day, her voice was hoarse, but her spine was straight. She rode home slow, letting the horse pick its way through the ruts. When she reached the house, Caleb ran to greet her, face smudged with dirt and the faintest scrape on his chin. "I helped Levy stack the kindling," he said breathless, "and I got to hold the hatchet, but only for a minute." Blythe crouched and kissed his temple. "That's more than enough for one day." Paxton waited on the porch, his suspenders loose over his shirt. "You look taller." "I think I might be," she said, smiling. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You coming back tomorrow?" "I think they'd notice if I didn't." He pulled her close, his voice low. "I noticed the second you walked through the door." Later, after supper, she and Paxton sat by the fire while Caleb slept upstairs in the loft. A light rain tapped the windows. She rested her head on his shoulder. "I didn't know I could have this," she said. "You earned it. I'm not afraid anymore, not of losing it." "You won't. We won't." She turned to him, her hand resting over his heart. "I love you," he smiled, soft and sure. "I've loved you since the day you didn't flinch." They kissed there in the quiet, the fire casting long shadows across the floorboards, the sound of rain steady and sure against the roof. Outside, the garden had begun to sprout in neat rows. The fence held. The horses were fed. The boy was safe. And Blythe, who had once believed she was built only for sorrow, now lived in a home filled with warmth, a man who chose her daily, and a child who called her mother with his eyes long before he would with his voice. That summer, they took the wagon north after the roundup. Caleb rode between them, pointing at deer trails through the brush and asking if they'd see a bear. They camped by Bear Creek, just as planned. Paxton caught fish with a line tied to a willow branch. Blythe taught Caleb to skip stones across the surface of the water. At night they lay beneath a wool blanket, all three of them, the stars thick above them. In the stillness, Blythe whispered, "We're whole." Paxton's hand found hers beneath the blanket. "Yes, we are." They returned home with sunburned cheeks and pine needles in their boots, and the schoolhouse welcomed her back with wildflowers left on her desk by one of the girls who couldn't spell her name yet but always arrived early to try. Years passed, and the fence never gave way. The garden grew taller each season. The schoolhouse windows stayed clean. Caleb found his voice, and when he said, "Mama," it came without hesitation, and the love between Paxton and Blythe never waned. It deepened, as real things do, binding them not through grand declarations, but through the steady, daily choosing of one another. In the quiet of their home, beneath the sky that hadn't once let them down, they lived the rest of their days side by side, not waiting for sorrow, only building joy.